Controversial theories, investigated now on BBC4.
The most celebrated human being in history was a first-century Jewish revolutionary called Jesus. Gospels do not just disagree about the number of angels or how many women arrived at the tomb. When it comes to the resurrection, the Gospels literally lose the plot. In the earliest versions of the earliest Gospel, Mark, there are no resurrection appearances at all. The Gospel simply ends with the discovery of an empty tomb. The last verses of Mark, which do contain resurrection stories, were added 200 years later. Matthew and Luke do have resurrection appearances, but they don't agree about the details. In Matthew, Jesus meets the women near the tomb and then meets his disciples just one time, and that is on a mountain in Galilee. In Luke, Jesus meets two unnamed disciples who do not recognize him, and then meets with the remaining disciples before leaving them in a village just outside Jerusalem. The last Gospel, John, has many different stories that do not appear in any of the other Gospels. Having all these differing Gospel versions of the story is confusing.
None of the Gospel stories is CNN in Jerusalem in the year 30.
These aren't people who are standing at the foot of the crucifix with notebooks in their hand, writing it all down.
The Gospels are written in the form of historical biography, so many people have assumed that they are exactly that. But that's not actually what they are. They're written to demonstrate to people the importance and the meaning of Jesus and his teaching. That was what they're for, and they do that very well. But they're not primarily interested in what actually happened back there.
So one is forced into the apparently blasphemous position of doubting the historical truth of the Gospels.
If you start saying it's blasphemous to question gospel truth, which particular bits of the gospel are you choosing to say that about? Or are you saying all of them? And if you say it's all of them, there are endless bits that contradict each other. I mean, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John tell different accounts. I mean, some of them don't even tell about Christ being born in a stable. You know, which bits are true and which bits aren't true? If you look at the Easter narrative, the key narrative of the different Gospels, they all tell different accounts. Some of them don't mention the Garden of Gethsemane. You know, what is gospel truth? There are 4 Gospels. They all tell different truths. Surely people have to realise that it's much more complicated than that.
These complications have led many modern scholars to suggest that the Gospel stories were not written to tell of a miraculous event, but that they were written with an entirely different and political motive.
So Peter is said to be the first witness of the resurrection. To this day, of course, for example, the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church claims to be the descendant of St. Peter, and authorized, by an unbroken chain of ordination from Peter. That is, the resurrection is taken to be validation, in many cases, of the authority of the churches.
Some scholars go so far as to suggest that the story of the resurrection was created not only to give authority to the church, but also as an extraordinary psychological tool to bring in new converts.
It's a bit like when you go into the army. The first thing we want is to take over your body. So symbolically, let's say we're going to shave all your hair. As long as you give in on this, we got you. We got your body, which is what we want. In one sense, sometimes the churches, some churches at least, do the same. We're going to tell you something unbelievable that you got to believe. If you believe it, then you will believe that they alone control heaven, that without them you cannot get into heaven, and then they've got you. You've left your brains in the parking lot.
That's a statement that may be offensive to many Christians. It would certainly be offensive to the worshippers at the Toronto Airport Church, who take their belief in the literal truth of the resurrection of Jesus very seriously indeed. But whatever is said in church, many modern Christian theologians no longer consider the resurrection to be an historical fact. And it's not just a 21st century problem that there are differences between what the church wants us to believe and what people actually do believe.
Look for the resurrection of the dead.
1,000 years ago, a group of devout Christians also held unorthodox views.
There have certainly down the ages been people within the bosom of Christianity who've had problems with the whole idea of resurrection and Christ's death and resurrection. If you look at the Cathars believed that the world was the creation of the devil, that it was irredeemably evil, everything about it was bad. So therefore they had great difficulty with believing the idea that Jesus would come here as a man anyway. Why would he want to come to this terrible place? But what they certainly had a problem with, why on earth would he be resurrected? Why would he want to come back to this earth? The church was so appalled by what it saw as this terrible blasphemy about the resurrection that they created the Inquisition. Off it went to the Cathars to the south of France, and it gouged out their eyes, it stretched them on racks, it burnt villages, it cut limbs off, and simply because it couldn't bear to hear people questioning these unquestionable truths as far as it was concerned.
In 1244, the last 200 of the Cathars were rounded up and burned at the stake as heretics. The Inquisition went on to spend 300 years suppressing anyone who questioned either the concept of gospel truth or the historical accuracy of the resurrection. But there is one story, also set in France at about the same time as the Cathars, which tells of another Christian group who made a discovery which really did suggest that the resurrection story was not true. And what they did was to hide the evidence.
Whatever it is, we do know one thing for sure. The secret that Saunier was giving clues to was heretical.
Saunier died in 1917 and took his secret with him to the grave. But that hasn't stopped enthusiasts like Thierry Lecomte from continuing to search on the basis of Richard's work and trying to solve the mystery. Using a local map on which the geometric lines have been transposed, Thierry has found further evidence of the Templars' existence, and he believes that he may be closing in on the location where the Templars could have buried the bones of Jesus.
Et j'ai mis à peu près 12 ans pour la trouver, cette fameuse croix.
Even if the Knights Templar did bring Jesus' bones in an ossuary back here from the Holy Land, it's unlikely that Richard Andrews or Thierry Lecomte would ever find them in these mountains. But there have been those who have gone back to the original and differing gospel texts and have found clues to a more credible but no less startling or heretical explanation of what might have happened to Jesus 2,000 years ago.
You read the story of the empty tomb, and on Friday someone is killed, and on Sunday they're gone from the tomb, and you ask the question, what might have happened? Either God raised him from the dead, which is the traditional Christian affirmation, or the body was carried away by someone, body stolen. And those two possibilities are even talked about in the New Testament.
According to Matthew, the Jews who were hostile to Jesus' followers claimed that his disciples had stolen his body out of the grave and then pretended he was resurrected.
While the enemies of Christians immediately came up with conspiracy theories to explain the resurrection, the stories told by the Gospels are very down to earth. They describe how Jesus was alive again. He ate, he drank, and Thomas could touch his wounds. It's therefore perhaps not surprising that people who have always looked for natural explanations of miracles have suggested that Jesus was alive because he didn't die on the cross.
There are many versions of that story. One came up in a book years ago called The Passover Plot, which suggested that he had been sedated on the cross, that he was removed quite early, and therefore could well have survived. That's certainly a possibility.
The disciples did manage to give Jesus some kind of substance on a sponge.
They filled a sponge with vinegar and put it upon hyssop and put it to his mouth.
And Jesus immediately died after taking this substance.
When Jesus had received the vinegar, he said, "It is finished."
But oddly enough, it isn't necessary to suggest that Jesus was sedated or drugged by whatever was on the sponge in order to believe that he could have survived. There are stories of people who did survive crucifixion. The Jewish historian Josephus wrote of one of his own friends surviving crucifixion in Palestine in the 1st century.
He's traveling out to a village named Tekoa to scout land for a Roman camp. And he notices that 3 of his friends are hanging on crosses. So he requests that they be allowed to, that they be brought down. And Titus, the Roman general, gives him permission. The 3 are brought down immediately and given medical care. And 2 of them died, but the third survived.
So is it possible that Jesus could somehow have survived? Certainly he was speedily executed, perhaps too speedily.
When you look at the story of Jesus and how he was executed by the Romans, he's on the cross for 6 hours. The assumption is that he's dead. The Roman soldiers check the body. There were 2 others crucified according to the gospel accounts. And they broke the legs of those to hasten their death because the Sabbath day was coming. When they came to Jesus, they said he's already dead. Presumably, his body's motionless, he's quit breathing. They then prepare the body and put him in a tomb. And presumably it's sealed up and he's dead for all practical purposes. The question, though, is he clinically dead?
The question of clinical death is certainly raised by the fact that the herbs Joseph of Arimathea took into the tomb with the body of Jesus were aloes. These are healing, not embalming herbs. So could it be that Jesus was resuscitated in the tomb?
A lot of modern people, I think, confuse the term resurrection with life after death. Resurrection is a Hebrew idea. And it's the notion that someone is in the world of the dead, which the Hebrews call Sheol, and they have their body's been buried, and they resuscitate or they come back. A term we might use today would be resuscitation more than resurrection. It would actually get the idea. We do have stories, both from the modern world and from the ancient world, where people appear to be dead, and for all practical purposes they are dead. That is, they're not responding to the outside world, but then they do, in fact, revive or come back. We call it resuscitation, but if you want to press the language, that would be resurrection.
Whatever actually happened, the different gospel stories do all agree that the disciples saw Jesus as if he were alive. But if Jesus survived, it doesn't necessarily mean that the resurrection was a hoax or a deliberate falsehood. At the end of the 19th century, the English writer Samuel Butler, in his book on the resurrection, came up with the theory that if Jesus had collapsed in a shock-induced coma on the cross and then recovered, he and the disciples would actually have believed his recovery was a miraculous resurrection.
That still has great credibility if you see it in the light, for instance, of more contemporary developments. Look at the near-death experience in the United States. Something like 13 million people in the United States say they've had near-death experiences. They've seen this white light. They believe it to be some form of miracle. So the idea that in the 1st century, when they had none of this scientific insight and they had none of these hospitals or whatever to save them, that people thought it, actually makes a lot of sense. Doesn't make them fraudsters or shysters. It actually makes them genuine people who thought they'd witnessed a miracle.
Whatever the circumstances, if Jesus was alive, then he and his disciples face a serious problem.
If Jesus was placed in the tomb and somehow was revived, he himself would certainly think that was an act of the grace of God. I came right to the bars of death and was brought back. But now there's a practical problem. It's a political problem, actually. Romans basically do one thing to messiahs. They crucify them.
It is clear that either through resurrection or resuscitation, Jesus did survive the crucifixion. But he faces a problem. He's a condemned man. The Bible is said to solve this problem with a miracle called the Ascension. Jesus is taken bodily into heaven. But the original texts are even more confused when it comes to the Ascension than they were about the resurrection. The Ascension does not actually appear in the original form of any of the Gospels. The Ascension references in Mark are among the verses which, as we have seen, were added 200 years after the events. There is one line in Luke which reads, "and was carried up into heaven." But again, this doesn't appear in all Bibles. It was in fact inserted simply because the ascension is referred to in a later book of the Bible, the Acts of the Apostles, and it's always been assumed that Luke was the author of Acts. There's no ascension in Matthew, and John's Gospel ends with the enigmatic words,
"And there are also many other things which Jesus did, the which, if they should be written every one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that would be written."
So what were the many other things that Jesus did? One of the stories that emerges from this question depends upon another heretical idea, that Jesus' relationship with Mary Magdalene was a very special one, perhaps even a sexual one.
If you read John's Gospel, the first person who saw the risen Christ, i.e. the first Christian, was Mary Magdalene. So I think when the church tries to sideline the idea that Jesus had relationships with women, that he had close relationships with women, it's laughable, really. I mean, it's part of this problem that they always say that that the thing that non-believers find hardest about Jesus was his divinity, and the thing that Christians always find hardest about Jesus was his humanity. I mean, he was a man. I'm perfectly happy with the concept that Jesus had a relationship with Mary Magdalene, that it was long and important and, you know, was one of the dominant things in his life. He was human.
Some historians go even further and suggest that Jesus and Mary might have married, and that they might even have had children. So if we are trying to find out where Jesus could have gone, perhaps we should start by finding out where Mary went. There is a tradition that some years after the crucifixion, Mary Magdalene came to the Camargue region of the south of France. Here she lived and died, and the Basilica Sainte-Marie-Madeleine is a shrine to her memory. This was the center of what became known as the cult of the Magdalene.
The cult of the Magdalene was very powerful in France up until the Middle Ages. The faithful wanted to believe in a mother figure, and the church were very anxious that they should not believe in Mary Magdalene as having been a mother figure for obvious reasons, which were that she might have been the spouse of Christ, that she might have had his child, that she might have produced a bloodline.
The local legends describe how Mary Magdalene came here with her brother Lazarus and her sister Martha and a few companions. Perhaps then, if the relationship between Jesus and Mary was as close as some sources suggest, one of those companions, traveling incognito for fear of arrest by the Romans, was Jesus himself.
Jesus could have taken ship at Caesarea or one of the smaller ports up the Syrian coast, and he could have left for another life. And he could well have arrived, as a lot of people believe, in this part of France and begun a new life. He could even have brought his family with him. So these stories could have a historical foundation.
After her death, Mary Magdalene's relics were placed in a sarcophagus and then hidden. It wasn't until 1279 that they were rediscovered. This basilica was built for their safekeeping, and sealed within the crypt, in the center of the church, is what is claimed to be the skull of Mary Magdalene. The idea that Jesus went to the south of France may seem far-fetched. After all, if any of the stories were true, it's hard to believe that the original writers of the Gospels could have completely eradicated all the evidence. If the faithful knew that Jesus was in fact still alive, surely they would have shared that knowledge, and surely they must have hoped that at some time in the future it would have been safe for Jesus to return, and evidence for that hope should be somewhere in the original text. It is. The disciples were expecting Jesus to return. They were expecting what has become known as the second coming. But this was not necessarily going to be a miraculous return.
Jesus definitely went away. Whatever view of resurrection you take, resuscitation or divine miracle, in the traditional sense of belief in resurrection, he goes away. He says, I'm going away. The disciples say, "Can we come?" He says, "No." And he says, "I'm going to come again." Now what's interesting about that is normally if someone says they're going away and they're going to come back, and you're sort of looking at your watch or your calendar wondering, okay, he said he went away, he's going to come back, you'd take it in that everyday sense.
The concept of a heavenly second coming with Jesus returning on the Day of Judgment was only created after it became clear that he had not returned in that everyday sense.
This is really, the second coming is one of the distinctive Christian ideas.
But does the concept of a heavenly second coming ignore the very matter-of-fact nature of some of the references to it in the Bible?
A lot of those references to Jesus coming back might in fact be taken more in an everyday sense of someone going away to accomplish a certain mission and then planning to return when that mission was accomplished.
But if Jesus did leave Palestine, France still doesn't seem a likely destination. It was, after all, a Roman colony. Some claim that if Jesus did survive the crucifixion, his first priority would be to escape from the jurisdiction of the Roman Empire.
You just look at a map. Palestine is on the far eastern border of the Roman Empire. If you go west, you're going right into the heart of Roman territory where we have our 15 legions stationed around the world. If you go east, you're crossing over into Parthia, and you're going towards Persia eventually, and India and Afghanistan, that direction.
And if Jesus thought he was the Jewish Messiah, there was another reason why he might have traveled east.
People forget that the Messiah's got to do essentially two things. Everyone remembers he's got to bring world peace and justice and defeat evil. That's all the way through the prophets. When the Messiah comes, he's the Prince of Peace. But the other huge task is he's got to gather all the scattered tribes of Israel back to the land of Israel. Now, this takes a bit of explaining, but it's not too complicated. The people we know today as the Jews are only one tribe, the tribe of Judah. And we have in the Hebrew Bible the story of 10 of the tribes being taken away to the east, to the northeast, by the Assyrians in the 8th century BC. They become known in history as the lost tribes because nobody knows exactly what happened to them. We do, though, we can speculate that if Jesus thought of himself as the Messiah, he might have had in mind, I've got to go and present myself to these dispersed brothers and sisters off wherever they might be.
The journey east from Israel in the 1st century was surprisingly easy, by land or by sea, on the Silk Route or the Spice Route. It's an accepted fact, for instance, that the disciple Thomas travelled to India and founded a church there.
The great tradition of the Indian church is that it was founded by Thomas the Apostle. To travel to India would be no problem. He just had to go down to Gaza and link up with one of the spice trains returning, and then from Yemen get a boat to India. It would have been a very simple, easy procedure that was done regularly.
Could Jesus have been taken to India as a child and taught to be a Buddhist? The Russian writer Nikolai Notovich, traveling in India in the 19th century, discovered an ancient manuscript in a Buddhist monastery in Tibet. In his book, The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ, Notovich translated this manuscript, and it tells of a divine child called Isa, born in the 1st century to a poor family in Israel. Isa came to India at the age of 14, where he learned the laws of Buddhism before returning to Israel at the age of 29. This idea would certainly explain the otherwise odd fact that from the age of 14, to 29, there is absolutely no record of Jesus' existence in Palestine. Certainly, the later teachings and miracles of Jesus have uncanny parallels with the teachings and miracles of the Buddha. Loving your enemies and the idea that the meek will inherit the earth have absolutely no tradition or precedent in Judaism, but they are entirely consistent with Buddhism.
He cometh unto them, walking on the sea. He walks upon the water without parting it, as if on solid ground. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. Riches make a man greedy, and so are like a caravan, lurching down the road to hell. Lay up for yourselves treasure in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. Let the wise man do righteousness, a treasure that others cannot share, which no thief can steal, a treasure which doth not pass away.
But if Jesus traveled or returned to the East, surely there would be legends, like those in the south of France, to support the idea. And of course, there are such traditions. In fact, the people here in Kashmir call their tribe Ben-e Israel and claim to be descendants of the lost tribes. And here there are stories that in the 1st century, Isa, known locally as Yusasaf, meaning leader of the healed, returned to Kashmir in his 30s. Yusasaf's ministry here can easily be seen as a continuation of the Jesus ministry. In a local temple called the Temple of Solomon, there used to be an inscription which told of Yusasaf's claim, made about 50 AD, to be Jesus, the prophet from Israel.
तमाम कश्मीर की तारीखों में यही लिखा है कि ये बाहर से आया है, ये प्रॉफिट था, ये पैगंबर था और इस्राइल से आया, नस्बैन से अंदर बॉर्डर में आया है और फिर यही तबलीग कर रहा है। वही जीसस है, वही मसीह भी है, क्योंकि यूज़ असब के माने हैं जो कोड़ी के मर्ज़ में हूँ उनको शिफा देने वाला, उनका इलाज करने वाला, जो शिफा याब हुए उसको यूज़ असब के दूसरे माने हैं कि यूज़ असब के दूसरे माने हैं जमा करने वाला।
Yusasaf continued to teach and to preach in Kashmir until he died around the year 80 AD. He was buried in Srinagar. And this rather modest building is, they say, his tomb. The first shrine erected around the site was built in 112 AD. In fact, it is now a shared gravesite. In the 15th century, the Islamic holy man Syed Nazir ud-Din was also buried here. Although both the gravestones under the cloth point north-south in the Islamic tradition, the body of Yusasaf is buried beneath in a grave dug east-west in the Jewish tradition. But this is a sacred site, and short of exhumation, there is no way of discovering whether the body buried here is that of a man who once survived crucifixion. However, next to the sarcophagus are the carved footprints of Yusasaf, and they do have marks or scars on them.
अच्छी उम्र में ये फोत हो गया है और उसके पाँव के निशानात का पत्थर पर उन्होंने कुंदा कर रखे हैं, जैसे कि थे वैसे ही रखे हैं निशान के तौर पर। उनमें जख्मों के निशानात बिल्कुल साफ नजर आते हैं। जो सलीब पर चढ़ाने की वजह से उनके पाँव में जख्म आए थे.
The position of the scars, just behind the toes, do not match each other, but they would align if a single nail was driven through both feet with the left foot placed on top of the right. There are many who believe this to be the tomb of Jesus. If this is the tomb of Jesus, then he spent most of his life in the mountain kingdom of Kasmir. He did not die on the cross. There was no resurrection. He did not ascend into heaven, and he does not sit at the right hand of God. For many Christians, this would be the end of Christianity as we know it. For some theologians, the story of the resurrection is little more than a witness to the grief felt by the disciples at the loss of their leader.
My own working assumption is that Jesus' followers were scattered and discouraged, as they said, and that some of them became convinced that he was actually alive. I don't know how that happened, but certainly it does happen, even today, that many people with a sudden or not sudden loss, bereavement, become convinced that the person that they thought they had lost is somehow alive. And that conviction apparently was very powerful for some of these people, and then it spread.
For others, the resurrection is purely a symbol of the continuing power of Jesus, summed up in the experience of the two disciples who had not recognized the risen Jesus until he broke bread with them.
And their eyes were opened, and they knew him.
The person who wrote that was not trying to describe an apparition. It would be like a preacher on Easter Sunday saying Jesus is among us this morning, and you don't expect people to go looking under the seats for where is he? They understand. It's the presence of Jesus they're describing. In one sense, it's a perversion of resurrection to reduce it to a body coming out of the tomb. Do you not believe? And it's bad history, not just bad theology.
Tomorrow, we follow a group of American missionaries devoting their lives to making a new version of a 25-year-old film about the life of Christ, which they're specifically targeting at a Muslim audience, selling Jesus at 10. Next tonight, which is the better read, Bridget Jones or Pride and Prejudice? A battle of the books coming up.